The morning sun cast long shadows across the elegant drawing room of Clarence's house as Charles sat alone with his cup of Earl Grey tea. The newspaper lay forgotten beside him, its headlines about economic reforms and political scandals seeming insignificant compared to the weight pressing on his chest. At 74, he had lived through decades of public scrutiny, family drama, and personal struggles, but nothing had prepared him for the growing distance he felt from Camilla. Their marriage had been a second chance at happiness for both of them. After the tumultuous years following Diana's death, the public battles, and the long journey to acceptance, Charles had finally found peace with the woman who had been his constant companion through life's storms. Camilla had stood by him through the worst of times, understanding his duties, his passions, and his fears in ways that no one else ever had. But lately, something had shifted. It started small, almost imperceptibly. Camilla would excuse herself to take phone calls, stepping into other rooms with an urgency that seemed out of character. Her phone, once casually left on tables or counters, now remained constantly in her possession. She had become protective of her messages, quickly closing her phone when Charles entered a room, offering explanations that felt rehearsed rather than natural. Charles tried to dismiss his concerns as the paranoia of an aging mind. After all, they were both busy people with numerous commitments, charitable obligations, and social responsibilities. It was natural that they might have separate communications that didn't concern each other. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. The royal staff had begun to notice too, though they were far too professional to comment directly. Mrs. Henderson, their longtime housekeeper, had mentioned in passing that the Duchess seemed quite occupied with correspondence lately. Even Detective Inspector Williams, Charles's personal protection officer, had observed that Camilla's routine had changed, noting new appointments and meetings that weren't on the official calendar. On this particular morning, Charles found himself alone earlier than usual. Camilla had left for what she called a charity planning meeting in London, though when Charles had casually asked which charity, her answer had been vague. She mentioned something about children's literacy programs, but the details were fuzzy, and she had seemed eager to change the subject. The house felt unusually quiet without her presence. Even their two Jack Russell Terriers, Beth and Bluebell, seemed to sense the tension that had been building over recent weeks. They lay listlessly by the fireplace, occasionally lifting their heads as if expecting their mistress to return at any moment. Charles walked through the familiar rooms, each one holding memories of happier times. The library where they had spent countless evenings reading together, sharing thoughts about books and current events. The garden room where Camilla would arrange flowers while Charles worked on his correspondence. The small sitting room where they had watched television together, laughing at comedies and discussing documentaries about history and nature. All of these spaces now felt touched by an inexplicable sadness, as if the very walls were absorbing the uncertainty that had crept into their relationship. The turning point had come 3 days earlier during a family gathering at Windsor Castle. The extended royal family had assembled for a routine dinner. Nothing particularly formal, just the kind of family meal that had become more precious as they all grew older. Charles had been engaged in conversation with his son William about environmental initiatives when he noticed Camilla step away from the group. She had moved to a corner of the room, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed tones that couldn't be heard over the general conversation. Her body language was different somehow, more animated than usual, and there was something in her expression that Charles couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the polite interest she showed during official calls, nor the warm affection she displayed when speaking with family members or close friends. When she returned to the group, Charles had asked casually who had called. Camilla had smiled and mentioned it was just a friend calling about weekend plans. But Charles knew most of Camilla's friends, had met them at various social functions over the years, and something about her explanation felt incomplete. Later that evening, as they prepared for bed, Charles had tried to bring up the subject again, approaching it from the angle of weekend social commitments. Which friend was calling about plans? He had asked, keeping his tone light and conversational. Camilla had paused in brushing her hair, meeting his eyes in the mirror of her dressing table. For just a moment, Charles thought he saw something flicker across her face, surprise, perhaps, or calculation. Then, she had smiled and mentioned a name he didn't recognize, someone she described as a new acquaintance from the gardening society. Charles had nodded and accepted the explanation, but something about the exchange had left him feeling unsettled. In all their years together, through all the challenges they had faced, honesty had been the cornerstone of their relationship. They had built their love on a foundation of complete openness, sharing their deepest thoughts, fears, and dreams without reservation. Now, sitting alone in his study, Charles reflected on the series of small incidents that had been accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon. The whispered phone conversations, the new appointments that weren't shared, the subtle changes in Camilla's demeanor that only someone who knew her intimately would notice. There was also the matter of her increased attention to her appearance. Camilla had always been elegant and well-groomed, understanding the importance of public presentation in their roles. But, recently, she had been spending more time on her hair and makeup, even for casual outings. She had purchased new clothes, more fashionable and youthful than her usual style, and had seemed particularly concerned with how she looked when leaving for her mysterious appointments. Charles remembered a conversation with his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, many years ago when he was struggling with the complexities of his first marriage. She had told him that relationships, particularly royal relationships, were like gardens that required constant tending. Neglect them, she had said, and weeds begin to grow in the most unexpected places. At the time, he had thought he understood her meaning. But now, faced with the possibility that weeds might be growing in his own carefully tended garden, he felt the full weight of her wisdom. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11, reminding Charles that Camilla's meeting should be ending soon. She had said she would be home for lunch, and punctuality was one of her reliable traits. He decided to use the remaining time to clear his head with a walk through the gardens. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of falling leaves and the last flowers of the season. Charles walked the familiar paths, observing the changes that came with the season. The roses that had bloomed so magnificently in summer were now preparing for winter's rest. The ancient oak trees were beginning their annual transformation, their leaves shifting from green to gold to brown. As he walked, Charles found himself thinking about the nature of trust and how it could be slowly eroded by small doubts and unanswered questions. He thought about the public's perception of his relationship with Camilla, how they had overcome so much skepticism and criticism to find acceptance and even affection from those who had once opposed their union. The irony was not lost on him that after surviving the judgment of an entire nation, he now found himself questioning the very foundation of the relationship that had given him such strength and happiness. When he returned to the house, Mrs. Henderson informed him that the Duchess had called to say she would be delayed and wouldn't be home until late afternoon. She had apologized and mentioned that the meeting had extended longer than expected, with additional discussions about upcoming events. Charles thanked Mrs. Henderson and retreated to his study, where he attempted to focus on his correspondence and official papers. But concentration proved elusive. His mind kept returning to the growing list of small inconsistencies and changes in Camilla's behavior. He found himself remembering their early years together, when they were both young and the world seemed full of infinite possibilities. Even during the long separation when they had married other people and lived separate lives, there had always been an understanding between them, an unspoken connection that transcended time and circumstance. When they had finally been free to be together openly, it had felt like coming home after a long journey through foreign lands. Every conversation had been a rediscovery, every shared moment a gift that they had learned not to take for granted. The afternoon stretched on, and Charles found himself checking his watch more frequently than usual. Camilla's lateness was becoming more pronounced, and when he tried calling her mobile phone, it went directly to voicemail. Her voice, recorded months ago, sounded warm and familiar, but somehow the message now seemed to mock his growing concerns. As evening approached, Charles made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just weeks earlier. When Camilla finally returned, full of apologies and explanations about traffic and extended discussions, he would have to address his concerns directly. The uncertainty was becoming unbearable, and their relationship deserved more than the shadow of doubt that was growing between them. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. The thought that had been forming in the back of his mind for days finally crystallized into a plan that both horrified and compelled him. He would need to see Camilla's phone. The decision felt like a betrayal of everything he believed about trust and privacy. But the alternative, continuing to live with growing suspicion and uncertainty, seemed worse. If his fears were unfounded, he would find a way to forgive himself for the violation and work to rebuild the trust he was about to break. If his fears were justified, then at least he would know the truth and could decide how to proceed. As darkness fell outside the windows of Clarence's house, Charles sat alone with his decision, understanding that whatever he discovered would change everything. The man who had spent his entire life in the public eye, subject to constant scrutiny and speculation, was about to cross a line that would make him question everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the price of certainty. The stage was set for a revelation that would shake the very foundations of his carefully constructed world, and Charles could only hope that whatever truth he uncovered would be something he could bear to live with. The opportunity came sooner than Charles had expected, arriving with the kind of cruel timing that seemed to suggest fate was forcing his hand. 3 days after his resolution to discover the truth, Camilla received an urgent call that would change everything. It was Thursday morning, and they were having breakfast together in the morning room, a rare moment of normalcy that Charles had been treasuring more deeply lately. Camilla was reading emails on her tablet while Charles reviewed his daily schedule with his private secretary, Simon Matthews. The conversation was routine, covering upcoming engagements, charity visits, and the logistics of the following week's trip to Scotland. Then, Camilla's phone rang. Charles noticed immediately that her demeanor changed when she saw the caller's name. Her face went pale, and she answered with an urgency that cut through the casual atmosphere of their breakfast. "Hello? Oh my goodness, when did this happen?" Her voice carried genuine distress, and Charles looked up from his papers with concern. "Of course, I'll come immediately. No, don't worry about anything else. I'll be there within 2 hours." She ended the call and turned to Charles with tears in her eyes. "It's my dear friend Margaret Thornfield. She's had a serious fall and been taken to hospital in Bath. The doctors think she may have broken her hip." Charles knew Margaret well. She was one of Camilla's oldest friends, a woman in her 80s who had been like a surrogate mother to Camilla after her own mother's death. Margaret lived alone in a large house outside Bath, stubbornly independent despite her age and the concerns of friends and family. "How awful," Charles said, reaching across the table to take Camilla's hand. "Of course you must go to her immediately. Would you like me to come with you?" "No, darling, that's very kind. But you have the veterans' lunch and the hospital opening this afternoon. Margaret's daughter is flying in from Edinburgh, and I think it would be better if I went alone. Too much fuss might overwhelm her." Charles nodded, understanding immediately. He squeezed her hand gently. "Take whatever time you need. Send her my love, and tell her we're thinking of her." Within an hour, Camilla had packed a small overnight bag and was ready to leave for Bath. Charles walked her to the car, noting her genuine distress and feeling ashamed of his recent suspicions. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, compassionate, loyal to her friends, willing to drop everything to be there for someone in need. "Drive carefully," he said, kissing her goodbye. "Call me when you know more about Margaret's condition." "I will," Camilla promised. "I'm not sure when I'll be back. It might be tomorrow if she needs surgery." As her car disappeared down the drive, Charles felt a mixture of relief and self-reproach. Here was a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of Camilla's recent mysterious appointments and phone calls. Perhaps Margaret had been having health issues that required more support than she was willing to admit publicly. Perhaps Camilla had been coordinating care and assistance, keeping it private out of respect for her friend's dignity. Charles threw himself into his official duties that day with renewed energy. The veterans' lunch was particularly meaningful, filled with stories of service and sacrifice that reminded him of the importance of duty and honor. The hospital opening went smoothly, with patients and staff showing genuine warmth and appreciation for the royal visit. But, as evening approached and he returned to an empty Clarence house, Charles found his mind returning to the questions that had been haunting him. The rational explanations he had constructed during the day began to feel less convincing in the quiet of his study. He called Camilla around 8 o'clock to check on Margaret's condition. Her phone rang several times before she answered, sounding tired and stressed. "Hello, darling. Sorry, I was just speaking with the surgeon. Margaret's hip is quite badly broken, I'm afraid. They're planning to operate first thing in the morning. Poor Margaret. How is she coping with the news?" "She's being very brave, as always. You know how she is, more concerned about being a bother than about her own pain. Her daughter arrived about an hour ago, which has helped tremendously." They talked for a few more minutes about Margaret's condition and the surgical plan. Charles offered again to join her, but Camilla insisted it wasn't necessary. She sounded genuinely exhausted, and Charles told her to get some rest. "I love you," he said before ending the call. "I love you too," she replied, but something in her voice seemed distant, distracted. Charles tried to settle into his evening routine, but sleep proved elusive. He found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling of their bedroom, thinking about trust and marriage and the small seeds of doubt that could grow into something larger if left unattended. The next morning brought news that Margaret's surgery had gone well, and that Camilla would be staying another day to help settle arrangements for her friend's recovery. Charles spent the day at Windsor, meeting with environmental scientists and reviewing conservation projects, but his concentration was poor. It was during the drive back to Clarence's house that evening that Charles made the discovery that would change everything. As his car pulled into the circular drive, he noticed Camilla's car was already there. His heart lifted. She had returned earlier than expected, which meant Margaret must be recovering well. He found himself quickening his pace as he walked toward the house, eager to hear the good news and to put his recent worries behind him. Mrs. Henderson met him at the door. "The Duchess returned about an hour ago, sir. She's upstairs changing for dinner." Charles bounded up the stairs with an energy that belied his age, calling out as he reached the landing. "Camilla? Darling, how's Margaret?" "Much better, thank goodness," came Camilla's voice from their bedroom. "The surgery went perfectly, and she's already complaining about the hospital food, which the doctors say is a very good sign." Charles entered the bedroom to find Camilla at her dressing table, removing her jewelry. She looked tired but relieved, and when she stood to embrace him, he felt the familiar comfort of her presence. "I'm so glad," he said, holding her close. "You must be exhausted. Why don't you rest while I have cook prepare something simple for dinner?" "That sounds lovely. I think I will lie down for a bit." As Camilla settled onto the bed, Charles noticed her handbag on the chair near the window. It was open, and her phone had apparently fallen out, lying on the carpet beside the chair. Without thinking, he walked over to pick it up, intending simply to place it on her bedside table. But as he lifted the phone, the screen lit up with notifications. Charles froze. The preview of a text message was visible on the lock screen, and what he saw made his blood run cold. "Missing you already. Tonight was incredible. Can't wait for Monday when C is in Scotland. Love you, my darling." The message was from a contact listed simply as A, and it had been sent 20 minutes ago, around the time Camilla would have been driving home from Bath. Charles stood motionless, the phone trembling in his hand. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. The timestamp showed the message had been received while Camilla was supposedly still at the hospital with Margaret. But if she was already on her way home, why hadn't she called to tell him? More importantly, who was A? And what did "tonight was incredible" mean when Camilla was supposed to have spent the night at Margaret's bedside? "Charles, is everything all right?" Camilla's voice came from the bed, and he realized he had been standing frozen for several moments. "Yes, sorry. Just checking something." His voice sounded strange even to his own ears. He quickly placed the phone on her bedside table and turned to face her, hoping his expression didn't betray the chaos of his thoughts. "Your phone fell out of your bag," he explained, trying to sound casual. "Oh, thank you, darling. I'm getting so clumsy with tiredness." Camilla's response seemed normal, but Charles found himself studying her face for any sign of deception. Had she seen him looking at the message? Did she know that he had seen it? "I think I'll go down and speak with Cook about dinner," he said, needing to escape the room before his composure completely crumbled. "Wonderful. I'll just rest my eyes for a few minutes." Charles walked downstairs on unsteady legs, his mind reeling from what he had discovered. The message had confirmed his worst fears. Camilla was involved with someone else. But it had also raised new questions. Who was this person? How long had this been going on? And, most painfully, how much of what she had been telling him was lies? He found himself in his study, sinking into the familiar leather chair behind his desk. The room that had always been his sanctuary now felt like a prison. The walls lined with books about history, philosophy, and statecraft seemed to mock him. What good was all his education and experience when he couldn't even recognize that his own wife was deceiving him? The message replayed in his mind. Tonight was incredible. What exactly had happened last night, while he believed Camilla was at Margaret's hospital bedside? The timestamp suggested the message had been sent as she was driving home, which meant she had been with this person just hours ago. Charles felt a wave of nausea as he considered the implications. Had Margaret's emergency even been real? Or was it an elaborate cover story for an affair that had been going on under his nose? He tried to think logically about what he had learned. The contact was listed as A, which suggested Camilla was being deliberately secretive about this person's identity. The familiarity of the message, "Love you, my darling," indicated this wasn't a casual acquaintance or a new relationship. This was someone who felt comfortable expressing deep affection and making plans for future meetings. The reference to Monday when C is in Scotland was particularly troubling. Charles was indeed scheduled to travel to Scotland on Monday for a series of environmental meetings. It was a trip that had been planned for months, and Camilla had declined to accompany him, citing scheduling conflicts with her own charitable commitments. Now he realized those scheduling conflicts might have been something entirely different. Charles felt the foundations of his world shifting beneath him. Everything he had believed about his marriage, about Camilla's commitment to their relationship, about the life they had built together, was suddenly called into question. The worst part was the loneliness of the discovery. As a public figure, Charles was used to dealing with crises, but those were always handled with the support of advisors, press secretaries, and family members. This was different. This was intensely personal, and he couldn't imagine sharing this burden with anyone else. He thought about calling his sons, William and Harry, but immediately dismissed the idea. They had their own lives and challenges, and this would only create more family drama. He thought about confiding in his sister, who had always been practical and straightforward, but even that seemed impossible. This was something he would have to face alone. As he sat in the gathering darkness of his study, Charles realized that his life had just divided into before and after. Before, when he believed his marriage was solid and his future secure. After, when everything he thought he knew was thrown into doubt. The sound of Camilla's footsteps on the stairs reminded him that he would have to face her again, have dinner with her, continue the pretense of normalcy while his world crumbled around him. But first, he needed to know more. The single message he had seen was just the tip of an iceberg that might destroy everything. If he was going to confront this situation, he needed to understand its full scope. He needed to see everything that was on that phone. The opportunity to examine Camilla's phone came the next morning in the most unexpected way. Charles had barely slept, spending the night alternating between desperate hope that he had misunderstood the message and crushing certainty that his worst fears were true. When dawn finally broke, he felt exhausted but grimly determined to learn the full truth. Camilla seemed refreshed after her rest, chatting cheerfully over breakfast about Margaret's progress and the arrangements being made for her recovery. She mentioned that Margaret's daughter was planning to stay for several weeks to help with rehabilitation, and that she felt comfortable leaving her friend in good hands. "I thought I might visit the Chelsea Flower Show committee this morning," Camilla said, spreading marmalade on her toast. "They're finalizing plans for next year's Royal Gardens display." Charles nodded absently, studying her face for any sign of deception. She seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the flower show, but then, again, he was beginning to realize how little he truly knew about his wife's ability to maintain appearances. "Will you be long?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "A few hours, I expect. These committee meetings can drag on terribly, but it's important to get the details right." After Camilla left for her meeting, Charles found himself pacing the house like a caged animal. Every room seemed to hold memories that now felt tainted by suspicion. The morning room where they had shared thousands of breakfasts, the library where they had spent quiet evenings reading, the garden where they had walked hand in hand discussing everything from politics to their grandchildren's futures. It was Mrs. Henderson who inadvertently provided the opportunity Charles needed. She appeared in his study around 10:30, looking slightly flustered. "Begging your pardon, sir, but the Duchess has called. She's forgotten her phone and wondered if someone might bring it to her. Apparently, she's expecting an important call about a charity auction." Charles felt his heart rate accelerate. "Where did she leave it?" "On her dressing table, sir. I noticed it when I was making the bed." "Don't worry, Mrs. Henderson. I'll take it to her myself." The lie came surprisingly easily. "I was planning to drive into London anyway." Mrs. Henderson looked relieved. "Very good, sir." She seemed quite concerned about missing the call. Charles climbed the stairs to their bedroom, his hands shaking slightly. Camilla's phone lay exactly where Mrs. Henderson had said, beside her jewelry box on the antique dressing table. The device looked innocent enough, just a simple smartphone in an elegant leather case. But Charles knew it held the key to understanding everything that had been happening to his marriage. He picked up the phone and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the locked screen. He realized he had no idea what Camilla's passcode might be. They had always respected each other's privacy, never asking for access to personal devices or correspondence. Now that respect felt naive, possibly even foolish. Charles tried the obvious possibilities first: Camilla's birthday, their wedding anniversary, her children's birthdays. Nothing worked. He tried variations using different date formats, still without success. Frustration began to build as the phone threatened to lock him out completely after too many failed attempts. Then, he remembered something. Camilla often spoke fondly of her childhood dog, a golden retriever named Goldie who had been her constant companion during her teenage years. She still became emotional when talking about that dog, and Charles had always been touched by the depth of her affection. With trembling fingers, he typed Goldie, followed by what he remembered as the year of the dog's birth. The phone unlocked immediately. Charles felt a moment of triumph followed immediately by a wave of guilt. He was violating his wife's privacy in the most fundamental way, crossing a line that marriages weren't meant to cross. But the memory of yesterday's message drove him forward. He needed to know the truth, regardless of the cost to his conscience. The home screen revealed nothing unusual. The standard apps, a photo of them together from their recent trip to Cornwall as the wallpaper, everything perfectly normal. Charles navigated to the Messages app with fingers that felt clumsy and foreign. The first thing he noticed was that the conversation with A had been moved to the top of the message list, indicating recent activity. His heart pounding, Charles tapped on it. What he found exceeded his worst nightmares. The conversation stretched back months, revealing a relationship that was clearly intimate, passionate, and ongoing. The messages painted a picture of stolen moments, secret meetings, and deep emotional connection that made Charles feel physically sick. Missing you terribly after yesterday. Your touch still makes me shiver. Can't wait until next week when we can have more time together. The way you looked at me across the room at the Thompsons' party last night nearly drove me mad. No one else exists when I'm with you. I keep thinking about what you said about leaving everything behind. Do you really mean it? Because I would do it in a heartbeat for you. Charles scrolled through message after message, each one more devastating than the last. The relationship revealed in these texts wasn't a casual affair or a moment of weakness. It was a deep, emotional connection that had been building for months while he remained completely unaware. The messages revealed specific details that confirmed Charles's growing suspicions about Camilla's recent absences. The charity meetings had been cover stories for assignations at various London hotels. The gardening society friends were fictional. Even Margaret's emergency, which had seemed so genuine, had provided cover for an overnight stay with her lover. But it was when Charles scrolled to the very beginning of the conversation thread that he received the most shocking revelation of all. The first message was dated nearly 8 months ago, and it was from Camilla. I can't stop thinking about lunch today. I haven't felt this alive in years. I know this is complicated, but I can't pretend these feelings don't exist. 8 months. This affair had been going on for 8 months while Charles had been completely oblivious. Every smile, every kiss goodnight, every I love you had been shadowed by this deception. The woman who had shared his bed, his meals, his public appearances, his most private thoughts and fears had been living an elaborate lie. Charles continued reading, learning more about the depth of Camilla's betrayal with each message. The affair wasn't just physical, it was emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. Camilla had found in this person something she apparently couldn't find in her marriage, and she had pursued it with a passion that Charles found both heartbreaking and incomprehensible. The worst discovery came when he found the photos. Mixed in with the text messages were images that Camilla had sent and received. Most were innocent enough, pictures of coffee cups, sunset views, flowers from various locations around London. But some were more intimate, revealing a side of his wife that he thought belonged only to their private moments together. There was one photo in particular that destroyed something fundamental in Charles's chest. It showed Camilla laughing at something off camera, her eyes bright with happiness and mischief. She was wearing the blue dress he had complimented just 2 weeks ago, the one she had worn to their dinner at the Savoy. At the time, he had thought she looked particularly beautiful and had told her so. Now he realized she had been wearing it for someone else. Below the photo was a message that made Charles's hands shake. You make me feel young again. Like the person I was before duty and obligations took over my life. The words hit Charles like physical blows. He understood exactly what Camilla meant, because he too sometimes felt the weight of royal duty, the constant public scrutiny, the endless demands of their positions. But he had thought they faced those challenges together, supporting each other through the difficulties of their unique life. Apparently, he had been wrong. As Charles continued to read, a clearer picture emerged of the person who had captured his wife's heart. The messages revealed someone who was clearly intelligent, cultured, and emotionally sophisticated. They discussed art, literature, politics, and philosophy with the kind of intellectual intimacy that Charles had thought he shared exclusively with Camilla. This person understood Camilla's sense of humor, shared her interests in gardening and interior design, and seemed to appreciate her in ways that made Charles question whether he had been taking his wife for granted. The conversations revealed depths of Camilla's personality that Charles felt he should have known about but somehow had missed. The timeline of the affair became clearer as Charles read through months of messages. It had begun with what appeared to be an accidental meeting at an art gallery in London. Camilla had attended an exhibition on contemporary British painters, something she had mentioned to Charles as a casual afternoon outing. But, according to the messages, she had struck up a conversation with someone who shared her passion for modern art. They had spent hours discussing the paintings, then continued their conversation over coffee, then dinner. What should have been a chance encounter between strangers had ignited something that neither of them had expected. The early messages revealed Camilla's internal struggle with her feelings. She had tried to maintain appropriate boundaries, to keep the relationship on a friendly but distant level. But the emotional connection had been too strong to resist, and within weeks they were meeting regularly, finding excuses to see each other that became increasingly elaborate as their feelings deepened. Charles found himself reading descriptions of their dates, their conversations, their growing intimacy, all written in Camilla's own words. She described this person as understanding me in ways I had forgotten were possible and making me remember who I was before I became who everyone expects me to be. The messages revealed that Camilla had been struggling with feelings of isolation and boredom in her royal role, emotions she had never shared with Charles. She wrote about feeling like she was performing her life rather than living it, going through the motions of charity work and public appearances without any real sense of purpose or passion. This other person had somehow broken through that emotional numbness, making Camilla feel vital and excited about life again. The transformation was evident in the progression of messages, as her writing became more animated, more playful, more alive as the relationship deepened. But perhaps most devastating of all was the discovery that Camilla had been making plans for a different future. Buried deep in the conversation was a series of messages discussing the possibility of leaving their current life behind, starting fresh somewhere away from the scrutiny and obligations of royal duty. I dream about waking up next to you in that little cottage we saw in the Cotswolds, Camilla had written. No schedules, no public appearances, no one watching our every move. Just us, living quietly, being ourselves. The response had been equally committed. I would give up everything for that life with you. We could be happy in ways we've never been able to imagine. Charles realized he was crying as he read these messages, tears falling onto the phone screen as he absorbed the magnitude of his wife's betrayal. This wasn't a casual affair or a moment of weakness. Camilla was actively planning to leave him, to abandon their marriage and their life together for this other person. Everything they had built together, everything they had overcome, all the love and support they had shared through decades of challenges, was being discarded for something that felt more exciting and less complicated than their royal obligations. Charles set the phone down with shaking hands and looked around their bedroom, seeing it now as a museum of a marriage that had already ended, even though he was only just discovering its demise. The photos of them together, the shared books on the bedside tables, the wedding ring that Camilla had removed and left on her dressing table, all of it felt like artifacts from a relationship that existed only in his memory. Charles sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the weight of discovery crushing down on him like a physical force. The phone lay beside him on the bed, its screen now dark, but the messages burned in his memory with perfect clarity. He felt as if he had aged decades in the space of a morning, the comfortable certainties of his life replaced by a hollow understanding of betrayal. The sound of a car door slamming in the courtyard below snapped him back to awareness. Camilla was returning earlier than expected from her committee meeting. Charles quickly locked her phone and placed it back exactly where he had found it on the dressing table, then hurried to his study, trying to compose himself before facing his wife. But composition proved impossible. When Camilla found him 20 minutes later, reading the same page of a biography of Churchill for the third time, without absorbing a single word, she immediately noticed something was wrong. "Charles, darling, you look terribly pale. Are you feeling all right?" She approached his chair with genuine concern, reaching out to touch his forehead in the automatic gesture of a wife checking for fever. Her touch, once so comforting, now felt like a lie against his skin. "I'm fine," he managed, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Just tired, I think. How was the committee meeting? Camilla studied his face with the kind of careful attention that made Charles wonder if she suspected something. It went well. We've settled on the theme for next year's display, Gardens of Memory, focusing on plantings that honor our history. But you really don't look well. Perhaps you should rest before this afternoon's engagements. The irony of her concern was almost unbearable. Here she was, playing the caring wife, while secretly planning to abandon their marriage for another person. Charles found himself studying her face, looking for signs of deception, wondering how he had missed the subtle changes that must have been there all along. Actually, Camilla continued, I forgot my phone this morning. Mrs. Henderson said you were going to bring it to me. I was delayed with some correspondence. Charles lied smoothly. Your phone is upstairs on your dressing table. Thank you, darling. I was worried I might miss an important call about the cancer charity auction. She paused, then added with what seemed like forced casualness. Did anyone call on the house phone for me? Charles felt a chill run through him. Was she expecting a call from her lover? Had they planned to speak while she was supposedly in her committee meeting? No calls that I'm aware of, he said carefully. Camilla nodded and excused herself to collect her phone and freshen up for lunch. Charles watched her go, noting the subtle spring in her step that he now understood had nothing to do with successful charity work. Left alone, Charles found himself facing a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could confront Camilla immediately, laying out everything he had discovered and demanding explanations. He could pretend ignorance and hire investigators to gather more evidence. Or he could try to fight for his marriage, attempting to win back a wife who apparently no longer wanted to be won. Each option seemed fraught with dangers and potential for greater pain. A direct confrontation might lead to immediate honesty, but it would also mean admitting to his violation of her privacy. Hiring investigators felt sordid and beneath the dignity of their positions. And fighting for someone who was already emotionally committed to another person seemed both futile and humiliating. As Charles wrestled with these impossible choices, his phone rang. The caller ID showed William's name, and Charles felt a moment of panic, wondering if somehow news of the crisis had already leaked. Hello, William. Hello, Papa. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all. How are Catherine and the children? Everyone's well, thank you. I'm actually calling about the environmental summit next month. I wanted to discuss the presentation on renewable energy initiatives. For the next 15 minutes, Charles forced himself to engage in a normal conversation with his son about work, family, and shared responsibilities. William's voice, so familiar and steady, provided an anchor of normalcy in the chaos of Charles's emotional state. But when the call ended, the relief was only temporary. The afternoon brought a series of official engagements that Charles had to fulfill despite his inner turmoil. A visit to a veterans care facility, a meeting with the directors of a conservation trust, and a reception for Commonwealth diplomats. Each event required him to smile, make conversation, and project the image of a content and engaged royal patron. The irony wasn't lost on Charles that his years of training in public duty, the very skills that had sometimes made his personal relationships feel formal and distant, now served to hide the destruction of his most important relationship. He could shake hands, make small talk about environmental policy, and express genuine interest in the work of various organizations, all while his marriage crumbled in secret. But it was during the reception for Commonwealth diplomats that Charles received a shock that nearly broke his carefully maintained composure. He was speaking with the High Commissioner from Canada about forestry conservation when he noticed a familiar figure across the room. The person was tall, distinguished, with silver-touched hair and an easy smile that had charmed everyone in their immediate vicinity. Charles recognized him as Andrew Sinclair, a prominent art dealer who had become increasingly visible in London social circles over the past year. Andrew Sinclair. Yes, in Camilla's phone. Charles felt the world tilt slightly as the pieces clicked into place. He remembered now that Camilla had mentioned Andrew Sinclair several times in recent months, always in passing, usually in connection with some gallery opening or art-related charity event. Charles had paid little attention, assuming he was simply another cultural figure in their extended social circle. Now, watching Andrew work the room with practiced charm, Charles understood that this man had been systematically destroying his marriage while maintaining the facade of casual social acquaintance. The boldness of it was breathtaking, pursuing an affair with the Duchess of Cornwall while moving freely in the same social circles, attending the same events, even exchanging pleasantries with the Duke himself at various functions. Charles watched Andrew's interactions with other guests, noting the easy confidence, the quick wit, the kind of intellectual charisma that he could understand might appeal to Camilla. Andrew was perhaps 10 years younger than Charles, successful in his own right, and free from the constitutional constraints that governed every aspect of royal life. It was exactly the kind of person who might make Camilla feel young again, as she had written in one of her messages. Charles excused himself from his conversation with the High Commissioner and moved deliberately across the room, driven by a compulsion he couldn't quite name. He found Andrew near the refreshment table, engaged in animated conversation with the ambassador from New Zealand about indigenous art traditions. "Mr. Sinclair," Charles said, interrupting the conversation with a smile that felt like broken glass in his mouth. "Your Royal Highness," Andrew replied, offering a perfect bow. His composure was complete, his expression showing nothing but appropriate deference and pleasure at the royal attention. "I believe you know my wife," Charles continued, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I understand you've been helpful with some of her charitable art projects." "The Duchess has been most gracious in supporting several exhibitions," Andrew replied smoothly. "Her passion for contemporary British art has been invaluable in raising the profile of emerging artists." The conversation continued for several minutes, covering neutral topics related to the art world and cultural preservation. Andrew was articulate, knowledgeable, and completely professional. Nothing in his demeanor suggested any improper relationship with Camilla. He was simply a successful businessman engaged in appropriate conversation with members of the royal family. But Charles found himself studying every word, every gesture, every micro-expression, looking for some sign of guilt or discomfort. He found none. Andrew Sinclair was either completely innocent or exceptionally skilled at deception. When Charles finally excused himself and moved on to other conversations, he felt more unsettled than ever. The man who was apparently dismantling his marriage was not an obvious villain or seducer. He was intelligent, cultured, and seemingly decent. Exactly the kind of person who might genuinely fall in love with Camilla and inspire the same feelings in return. This realization made everything worse. Charles could have dealt with a fortune hunter or a social climber who was using Camilla for personal gain. Those motivations he could understand and combat. But genuine love, authentic emotional connection, the kind of relationship that might actually make Camilla happier than her marriage, that was something else entirely. The remainder of the reception passed in a blur of diplomatic conversations and ceremonial obligations. Charles functioned on autopilot, his public persona carrying him through while his private thoughts churned with newfound knowledge and impossible decisions. When he finally returned home to Clarence House that evening, Charles found Camilla in the garden room, arranging flowers from their greenhouse. She looked serene and beautiful in the soft lighting, humming quietly to herself as she worked. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so reminiscent of thousands of similar moments they had shared over the years, that Charles felt his resolve waver. "The dahlias are particularly lovely this year," she said, looking up with a genuine smile. "I thought these would look nice on the dining room table for tomorrow night's dinner with the Weatherbys." Charles nodded, remembering that they had longtime friends coming for what should have been a pleasant, intimate evening. The normalcy of planning for social obligations while his marriage was secretly ending felt surreal. "How was the Commonwealth reception?" Camilla asked, arranging the stems in a crystal vase that had been a wedding gift. "Quite successful. The new initiatives for cultural exchange seemed to have strong support." Charles paused, then added with careful casualness, "I met Andrew Sinclair there. He speaks very highly of your work promoting emerging artists." Charles watched Camilla's face carefully as he mentioned Andrew's name. For just a moment, he thought he saw something flicker across her expression, surprise, perhaps, or concern. But it passed so quickly that he might have imagined it. "Oh yes, Andrew has been wonderfully supportive of several charitable exhibitions," she said evenly. "He has excellent connections in the art world." The conversation moved on to other topics: their upcoming trip to Scotland, plans for Christmas at Sandringham, a new environmental initiative that Charles was developing. They talked for nearly an hour, sharing thoughts and making plans for a future that Charles now knew might not exist. As they prepared for bed later that evening, Charles watched Camilla perform her nightly routine with the kind of attention he usually reserved for state documents. Every gesture seemed significant now, every expression potentially revealing hidden truths. When she emerged from the bathroom in her nightgown, her face clean of makeup and her hair brushed, she looked exactly like the woman he had fallen asleep beside for years. But Charles now understood that appearances could be devastatingly deceptive. "I love you," she said softly as she settled into bed beside him. The words that had once been a source of comfort and strength now feeling like mockery. "I love you too," Charles replied automatically, the response so habitual that it came without thought. But as he lay in the darkness beside his wife, listening to her breathing gradually settle into the rhythm of sleep, Charles knew that whatever love existed between them was now competing with something else, something that might already have won the battle for Camilla's heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and the need to determine whether their marriage could survive the truth he had discovered, or whether love, duty, and decades of shared life would prove insufficient against the power of a passion that promised to set Camilla free from the golden cage of royal obligation. The confrontation came 3 days later, not by Charles's design, but through the cruel intervention of fate. He had spent those days in a state of suspended animation, carrying on normal conversations with Camilla while secretly wrestling with the knowledge that was eating him alive from the inside. Every smile she gave him felt like a lie, every casual touch a betrayal, every "I love you" an insult to everything they had once shared. Charles had decided to wait until after his trip to Scotland to confront the situation. He needed time to think, to plan, to decide how to handle the destruction of his marriage with the dignity and discretion that their positions demanded. But the universe, it seemed, had different plans. It was Sunday morning, and they were having breakfast in the morning room when Camilla's phone rang. Charles had become hypersensitive to every call she received, and he noticed immediately that she glanced at the screen, and then quickly declined the call. "No one important," she said casually. But Charles had seen the name on the display, Andrew. 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time Camilla answered, but with obvious reluctance. "Hello." Her voice was carefully neutral, but Charles could see tension in her posture. "I can't talk right now," she said quietly, glancing at Charles. "I'll call you later." She ended the call quickly, but Charles had heard enough. Even across the table, he had caught fragments of a voice he now recognized, speaking with an urgency that suggested something important was happening. "Everything all right?" Charles asked, keeping his tone light. "Just a committee member with questions about the auction scheduling," Camilla replied, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. 20 minutes later, as they moved to the library to read the Sunday papers, Camilla's phone buzzed with a text message. She picked it up automatically, then froze as she read what was on the screen. Charles couldn't see the message, but he could see Camilla's face go pale with what looked like panic. "Charles," she said slowly, "I'm afraid I need to make a quick trip to London. There's been a problem with one of the charity auctions, and they need me to sort it out in person." It was exactly the kind of excuse she had been using for months, and Charles felt something break inside him. The careful restraint he had been maintaining, the dignified patience he had been cultivating while he decided how to handle their crisis, simply evaporated. "What kind of problem requires your immediate presence on a Sunday morning?" he asked, his voice sharper than he had intended. Camilla looked startled by his tone. It's complicated. Some of the donated artwork has been questioned for authenticity, and they need someone there who understands art valuation." "How convenient that you've become such an expert in art authentication," Charles said, standing from his chair. "Tell me, Camilla, does this problem have anything to do with Andrew Sinclair?" The effect of his words was immediate and devastating. Camilla went completely white, and her hands began to tremble. For a moment, she said nothing, and Charles could see her mind racing, trying to construct an explanation that might salvage the situation. "Charles, I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything," Charles interrupted, his voice now cold and steady. "I'm asking directly whether your urgent Sunday morning trip to London has anything to do with Andrew Sinclair, the man who's been sending you messages about missing you and looking forward to time together when I'm away." Camilla sank into the nearest chair as if her legs would no longer support her. When did you? Does it matter?" Charles asked. "The question is whether you're going to continue lying to me or whether you're finally going to tell me the truth." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Camilla sat with her head in her hands, and Charles could see her shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or simply the physical manifestation of shock. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red with tears, but her voice was steady. "Yes," she said simply. "I was going to see Andrew." The admission, even though Charles had known it was coming, hit him like a physical blow. Hearing her confirm his worst fears made them real in a way that all his private suspicions and secret knowledge hadn't quite accomplished. How long? He asked. 8 months, Camilla whispered. And Margaret's emergency? Was that real? Camilla's silence was answer enough. Charles felt a rage unlike anything he had ever experienced building inside him, not just at the betrayal but at the elaborate nature of the deception. So while I was worrying about your dear friend Margaret, sending flowers and messages of concern, you were actually in bed with another man. Charles, please what? His voice rose despite his attempts to maintain control. Please understand. Please forgive. Please pretend that 8 months of lies and deception is somehow acceptable because you were unhappy. Camilla stood up, her own composure beginning to crack. It wasn't supposed to happen. I never intended for any of this. But it did happen. Charles cut her off. You made choices, Camilla. Every lie, every fake appointment, every time you looked me in the eye and told me you loved me while you were planning to meet another man. Those were all choices. I do love you, Camilla said desperately. Charles, you have to believe that I never stopped loving you. Then why? The question came out as almost a whisper, all the anger suddenly drained from Charles's voice, replaced by a profound sadness. Why wasn't our love enough? Camilla sank back into her chair, tears flowing freely now. Because I was drowning, she said. I was drowning in duty and expectation and the constant feeling that I was performing my life instead of living it. And Andrew made me remember who I was before all this. Who you were before all this was married to me. Charles pointed out quietly. That's not what I meant, isn't it? You've been planning to leave, Camilla. I've seen the messages about cottages in the Cotswolds, about starting fresh away from royal obligations. You've been planning a future that doesn't include me. Camilla's tears stopped abruptly, replaced by a look of shock. You read everything? I read enough to understand that our marriage has been over for months, and I was apparently the only one who didn't know it. Charles, those were just fantasies. We weren't actually planning. Don't, Charles said firmly. Don't make this worse with more lies. I read the messages, Camilla. I know exactly how far this has gone and how real your plans are. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of confession settling between them like a physical presence. Charles found himself studying his wife's face, noting the relief that seemed to be mixing with her distress. Part of her, he realized, was glad that the truth was finally out. What happens now? Camilla asked eventually. It was the question Charles had been dreading, because he honestly didn't know the answer. The practical considerations were staggering. They were not just a married couple facing infidelity. They were public figures whose relationship was part of the constitutional framework of the nation. Their divorce would be front-page news around the world, would raise questions about Charles's fitness to be king, would subject their families to unprecedented scrutiny. But, beyond the public implications, Charles was struggling with the personal devastation. This was not just the end of his marriage. It was the destruction of his vision for the rest of his life. He had imagined growing old with Camilla, facing the challenges of his eventual reign with her support, leaving behind a legacy of service that they had built together. All of that was gone now, replaced by the prospect of a very public scandal and a very private heartbreak. I don't know, Charles admitted. I honestly don't know what happens now. Do you want me to end it? Camilla asked quietly. With Andrew, I mean. Do you want me to try to fix this? Charles looked at his wife, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months. He could see that she was genuinely asking, genuinely offering to sacrifice what appeared to be the great love of her later life for the sake of their marriage and their mutual obligations. But he could also see, in the way she held herself and the look in her eyes, that such a sacrifice would destroy something essential in her spirit. She had found something with Andrew Sinclair that she clearly couldn't find in their marriage, and asking her to give that up would be asking her to return to the drowning feeling she had described. Do you want to fix this? Charles asked instead. Camilla was quiet for a long time, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. When she finally answered, her voice was barely audible. I don't think I can, she said. Charles, I'm so sorry, but I don't think I can. It was the answer Charles had expected, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like being stabbed. The finality of it, the quiet certainty in Camilla's voice, told him that this wasn't a crisis that could be weathered or a mistake that could be forgiven. This was the end of their marriage, stated as simply and directly as possible. Then, I suppose we need to discuss how to proceed, Charles said, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for difficult state business. Charles, Camilla said, reaching toward him, I want you to know that these have been the happiest years of my life. What we built together was real and meaningful, and I will never regret. Don't, Charles interrupted, pulling away from her touch. Please don't try to comfort me with memories of our happiness. Not right now. Camilla withdrew her hand, nodding with understanding. Of course. I'm sorry. They spent the next hour discussing the practical details that would need to be addressed, when to inform the family, how to handle the media, what kind of timeline they were looking at for separation and eventual divorce. It was the most civilized conversation about the end of a marriage that Charles could imagine, conducted with the kind of courtesy and mutual respect that somehow made it even more heartbreaking. As Camilla prepared to leave for London, this time honestly acknowledging that she was going to see Andrew, Charles found himself standing at the window of the library, watching her car disappear down the drive for what he knew might be the last time. The house felt different immediately, as if Camilla's departure had taken something essential from its atmosphere. Charles wandered through rooms that suddenly felt too large and too quiet, wondering how he would begin to rebuild a life that had been so thoroughly defined by their partnership. But, perhaps most devastatingly, he found himself wondering if Camilla was right to leave. If he had been so caught up in duty and tradition and the complex requirements of royal life that he had failed to nourish the parts of their relationship that mattered most. If, in trying to be a good king-in-waiting, he had forgotten how to be a good husband. The questions would haunt him for months to come, as the practical reality of separation gave way to the deeper work of understanding how love, even deep and genuine love, could sometimes be insufficient to sustain a marriage against the weight of unfulfilled dreams and the promise of a different kind of happiness. Charles had checked Camilla's phone and discovered the truth that ended everything. But, in the quiet of his empty house, he began to understand that the truth had been there all along, written in the gradual distance between them, in the small silences and polite conversations, in the slow drift from intimacy toward mere companionship that he had been too busy or too afraid to notice. The phone had simply confirmed what his heart, if he had been brave enough to listen to it, had already known.